politics and economics. And thanks for listening to some of my videos already. Today I want to talk about the American elections and how we can start the American-European decade together with our partners, friends and allies, the Americans, and how I think and I call all European leaders to endorse the Biden-Harris presidency now. That might be surprising for some, but I see the president of the European People's Party, he has very correctly and courageously endorsed President Biden in this election, and I think he knew very well why he did that, because we have seen the 4 years of the Trump presidency were very negative for NATO, were very negative for the Europeans, and also they were not producing any of the promised results for the Americans, in my view. Most of the Europeans anyhow support very much Joe Biden in this context. You see here with 38% and with 83% to 17%. And I really hope that he wins. And let me sum it up. We have great hopes for President Biden to be the supporter of NATO enlargement, to contain Russia, to have a free trade agreement with America and the EU. And that is, of course, in one line, Europeans for Joe Biden, the Russians for Donald Trump. He was really the Russian candidate in so many respects. And from our perspective, from European perspective, I can just hope that there will be President Biden from next week on. And some in Europe don't share that. You know, the Prime Minister of Slovenia has most famously endorsed President Trump. And, you know, he's free to do so. I criticized him because I have then called him not to understand the changing times. And I hope the times are changing. Obviously, nobody knows the final result now coming up. But I want to explain in this video why Biden is much better president and why we need a much closer cooperation with the Americans. And I want to start with an apology, because that's also very important to start with an apology, because so welcome to our debate about this. We have a lot of anti-Americanism in Europe. We have really a lot of negative feelings towards the Americans in various aspects and segments of our Europe is a very diverse continent, from the left to the right, from the center to the south. There's different reasons for this anti-Americanism, but it is there. And it's, I think, completely wrong. It's the original sin of the Europeans in many aspects. And if we want to build a strong Europe, we cannot build it against America or apart from America, but together with the United States. Yeah? And we have to do our homework first. Yeah? That means to get Ukraine in the EU, really have a stronger currency by more Eastern Europeans as well using it, being in favor of securing the eastern border with Russia by enlarging EU and NATO, and also to really use the existing tools in coordination with the Americans, especially OECD and the UN much better, and also be more united, that we're also more credible. That means the French Security Council seat to be transferred to the EU, and not to build Europe against America, but together. And not to let the French basically drag us into any kind of anti-American direction. But in this kind of contrast I want to make here in this slide between President Macron and Jean Monnet, we have to go for a Monnet Europe, for a unification process of Europe according to his vision, and not as some French leaders sadly also have it, to go into some kind of non-aligned Europe, a Europe between USA and Russia, a kind of Yugoslavian third way that will also lead in a complete disaster, and I'm completely against it. Let me go back a little bit in history. You see, the first big crisis of this century, 1907, was still very badly managed. The American crisis basically exported in the whole world and leading to massive revolutions in Mexico, China, in the Ottoman Empire, and ultimately to the First World War, because there was no global anchor power available. The US didn't have the institutions and also not the sense of responsibility to really ensure global stability economically, politically, and strategically. And this is what then later, only after the Second World War, in the Cold War, America was then ready to do. And we have to actually be very careful to keep America engaged, because this is really the key for our present world order. And the chaos we have seen without it was really terrible. So the Americans have, after the First World War, withdrawn from the world in this terrible 19th of November 1919 decision, and several others further, not to join the League of Nations and not to ratify the Versailles Treaty. And here you could really see, after a brief moment of responsibility engagement, then again this Trumpian isolationism, and it was really disastrous for the world, is something we have to be very careful not to antagonize America into this kind of dangerous, toxic, protectionist, isolationist, anti-migration line of thinking, which unfortunately Trump is representing. And so we hopefully won't see him again in the White House. You know, that was then the 26th of May, 24. That is, in my view, the most terrible moment in US history, concerning Europeans, because especially to block out poor Eastern Europeans, basically from the Russian, from the Austrian Empire, from the Ottoman Empire, people from the Balkans and from Eastern Europe, and Austrians and Germans. Yeah, they have started this terrible quota system in the 26th of May 24, and this was really the start of the Second World War in many ways, because it has led all to this overflow of European people in Europe not able to really find a decent life here under our conditions in the 20s, and the Americans locked the doors. And the Americans have created an artificial bubble by this, locking out the labor factor from Europe, and then it went into this boom-bust cycle, which has led to the big disaster of the Great Depression. And, you know, this is really racist, was terrible, and this was really a disastrous politics. And I call on this day every year for the European Day for a common US and EU labor market. This is ultimately what we have to achieve. The Americans, every citizen from America, to be able to work in every EU member state, just in its confirmed labor position, a contract, and then to get a work and residence permit. And the same for us. Yeah? The Europeans from all EU 27 and more to have this opportunity. And this is the way we can create massive new level of prosperity and overcome our divisions. Then it took basically, for a more reasonable approach in the American immigration policy, it took until 1968. Yeah, we lost no less from 24 to 68. Yeah, over 44 years the Americans were blocking against Eastern Europeans, and then on the 30th of June in 68, the Hart-Celler Act was opening again under difficult circumstances. It's very controversial, but it opened America again for the Europeans. And now, I think, especially after the fall of the Cold War, we have a much more open America for many of the Eastern Europeans who left there and built a new life and contributed to American prosperity. And this was a very important, decisive day, and this has to be celebrated. The Americans, terrible enough, they went into complete protectionism after blocking out the people. They blocked out the trade as a response to the Great Crisis. On the 7th of June, this was terrible legislation, good golly, smooth Haley, really terrible, and then a big rise in protectionist tariffs. And this should always live as the European Day for Free Trade, WTO and FTAs. We have built this very, very important post-World War II trade system, the EU, one of the pillars, but obviously the WTO got, in order not to have any repeat of a protectionist kind of backslash in a crisis. Now with Trump we had it again. We were able to maneuver, but more of it, more 4 more years, that would be really too much. Yeah? And hopefully he won't win. And hopefully also the Europeans have learned in that shock how important it is to keep the trade open and free. The Americans made a big third major mistake in that year 33. It was President Roosevelt back then, but he basically left in this London conference, devaluated the dollar, and it was a big currency crisis, the so-called Roosevelt bombshell in the year 33, and between June and July, and it was really the triple shock of the Great Depression, the trade protectionism, the migration, the stock exchange, and then the currency chaos which came, and really it was a disaster, and it took many years to recover from that, and it was quite terrible. The Americans obviously and the world has learned from these disasters. After the Second World War, already in 1944, it was really, and that's why I call it the European Days to celebrate wisdom of global good economic governance. This is Bretton Woods. This is the conference where all these disasters of the interwar years have led to a better global economic governance backed by the US and the US Federal Reserve. And so all the shocks of the past were somehow culminating in a consensus to build a better World Bank, IMF, and everything started slowly, but it was able to manage the post-World War II global economic order more or less quite successfully. And we should be very much celebrating the Bretton Woods spirit, and it was a big success. So now we come to the present time again after this little kind of discussion, but also we will discuss about the history. Because you see, America first, yeah? This was the slogan of Trump already in 2016. Yeah? And, you know, it doesn't need an Austrian guy to tell the Americans their own history. But, you know, this was the slogan of these terrible people who were so dangerous in the 40s, yeah? Of Lindbergh. He was the spokesman of the American First movement, yeah? And Trump certainly knew it. And if he knew it, then people in the Republican Party knew. You know, these were the people who were against American intervention on the side of the UK and the West. Yeah? These were the people, if they would have prevailed, yeah, and it would have been a victory of the Nazis. Yeah? And these are the most dangerous people in American history for us Europeans. Yeah? Maybe some in America think they were cool guys, but I have to see the world out of the European perspective. Yeah? And then, you know, that was all well known that he contends to that direction, because Trump was a famous political personality, public personality already for decades, since the 80s. Even I knew him from the media in the 80s and 90s. Yeah? So it was very clear what he represents, what kind of American first that is, yeah? What kind of nativism that will be, what kind of populism that is. His statements against NATO were very well known. You know, I have here American First people. Maybe it's not entirely fair to Lindbergh to put him here with Goering, but you know, he was meeting him. Yeah? He was ready for dinners with him before the World War II, and you know, they had a soft spot on the Nazis, these American Firsters. Yeah? There's no doubt historically about that one. And you know, Rhys Previous, that's the chairman of the Republican Party, he had the choice. He had the choice to include Trump into the Republican primaries, or he had to be a third-party candidate. Of course, that was the threat. But they hated Hillary so much, they wanted to let the fury of Trump into the Republican fold, and that's what I call a Faustian bargain. Yeah? I mean, I have no doubts. I was for Jeb Bush. Yeah? There's no question about it. Yeah? But then, of course, Jeb Bush, he was a much too serious person against the cage fighter. And that was the debate on the 13th of February 2016. Basically, he destroyed Jeb, then he destroyed the other candidates with his media personality, and then, you know, Rhys was the chief of staff for 2 weeks or whatever. He got the prize, and the Republicans got also 4 more years, in a way, from they have defeated Hillary, they have 4 more years. They get 3 more Supreme Court judges. They made one tax reform. How sustainable that will be, we will see. But you don't see that now behind this video inlay of mine. But then, you know, you had 4 more years of this Russian-American alliance. And very terrible years for the European-American relations. And, you know, that was all the price. And now I think it will be a major landslide for the Democrats. And so the previous person I particularly despise, and I give him a lot of personal blame on all this, because he was really thinking he's smart and he can do that. He very well knew, I'm sure, the political consequences of this, but he was ready to buy the Republicans 4 more years with the fury of Trump, and now will come the payback time for this one. And I didn't support it in 2016, and I won't support it now this year, and I hope that it won't go wrong, the whole thing, for America and the world, and still the damage can be repaired. Austrian bargain. And, you know, just to make very sure, what I'm saying here is that the whole world order is based on exactly having defeated the American firsters in the year 1940. And, you know, that's the whole victory of World War II, that's the victory in the Cold War, that's the post-war prosperity system, world order, you want to call it. And this one is what these people want to take down. And that's extremely dangerous for us Europeans. It's not funny. So what we really need is leadership and enlargement of NATO. You know, that's what I argue since years, you know, to have NATO membership from Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, together with the 3 remaining countries in the Balkans, and also the neutrals in the EU to join. So we are now 30 and 12 more, 6 neutrals in the EU, and 6 Eastern Europeans is 42. And, you know, this is the strength, and that will stabilize Europe, and that will stabilize Europe because there will be clarity in our relation with Russia, and there will be much less conflicts, and this is the way for a very successful another 30 years of the Cold War victory time, I call it, the last 30 years from 1990 to 2020. This were utterly successful for the West, and we have to make sure that we have similar successful years for the next years. So I have made this slide here now for the key demands, what we have, reforming the OECD as the global outreach level, including more people, obviously not the Russians, but including Brazil and Indonesia, India, Mexico, Australia. That's very good. And also keeping, hopefully, the tax cuts, which were very good. But I was recently thinking, if the Americans want higher taxes again, you know, then the capital will flow back to the European Union. So it is only hurting the Americans. We will definitely, I don't think there will be a lot of European tax increases. We will keep the competition high. We will keep the taxes low. So I can only recommend that also for Biden not to do the one good thing Trump did, the tax cut to reduce that. Anyhow, a free trade agreement with the US, that's long overdue, 20 years in the waiting. And we have now, luckily, the Mercosur agreement already. So it's now really time for the second big American agreement. And obviously NATO, that's basically the way we have to work. I have seen here the analysis what Biden would really want. So let's see that some of the things hopefully will be still in discussion. And we hope that we will have exactly the most important points are anyhow this. I made a slide for each of the 12 new members, which I recommend, from Ireland and to Austria to join NATO, Serbia obviously to be invited, and all Cyprus to be united, and also then of course always only free Ukraine, free Georgia, free Moldova. You know, NATO is a voluntary defense alliance, so we don't ask anybody, you know, we can anyhow make no security guarantee for Crimea or for occupied Donbass. But on the BRD, the Western German role model, all these countries can join, and this is basically securing Europe together with the Americans. and then we can go much more safer in the next years. That should be happening very fast. On one issue, obviously, that needs to be addressed. The Chinese WTO accession was super successful, but it was a little bit too successful, and we were a little bit easy on them when it comes to rules, regulations, and standards. And when you see this enormous explosion of GDP, obviously was good for the whole world, not only for the Chinese, to have so much more global output, but obviously it needs adjustment. And, the way he has done it was, of course, not correct, risking a trade war, but this issue has to be addressed, and a new equilibrium has to be found with China. That's absolutely necessary. And that's, coming to some of the positive results, because in 4 years, when you are the leader of the West, you not only do negative things. He did the tax cut, he organized the Israelis recognizing Kosovo, and also several other Arab countries have organized Kosovo and Israel. That was very good. And also 2 more countries, Montenegro and North Macedonia, have joined NATO. That is really very important. And so that was some positive things, which are really important, but for 4 years being the president of the US and the leader of the free world and of NATO, that's not enough for a re-election. So let's come to the issues which were really shaking the whole fundament and why also Trump became president. In the year 2016, it was the 3rd of April when the Panama Papers were launched, and Putin obviously thought that this is a CIA trap against him. And then all the things started to escalate in that moment. And because all this massive wealth which Putin has hidden in Panama and in the Panama Papers. And so this has led to the funding for the Brexit campaign. It was only 2 months later. And then basically we had all this mess happening in the UK, because without the Russian scheming, there would have been also, it would have been a close result, but there would have never been a yes without Russian funding, without Russian manipulations of the migration crisis, the Syrian war escalation. This is all the context where this can be only explained, and the funding obviously to this British financier who was promised this gold mine in Russia. Anyhow, so then it was coming the 22nd of July. That was the day the emails were dumped in the democratic servers, and I have marked it as a kind of a clear day where we have to organize ourselves more against dependency from Russia. This is basically by being more united, but the Russians always try to divide us in Europe. We are all much smaller than Russia alone, and they can easily pick and choose without American support and European unity. We are in a big mess here, and I have made a list of 14 demands what really needs to be done in order to decrease the dependency on Russia, mainly to go into energy efficiency and reducing the dependency on energy purchases from Russia, and to build more unity in the European Union. That's absolutely the most important. So now the UK is anyhow gone. It's a tragedy, obviously, and it is this year, end of the year, also to leave the internal market, the customs union, and that's, of course, a big shock economically for Europe. And this is what Russia wanted from the start. So what is our response? And the only logical response for this biggest shock in European economic history since World War II is obviously in the middle of a pandemic, additionally, is to be more open towards Ukraine and the Balkans and get them in, because we just lost 67 million, we are just losing 67 million Europeans, and we have 67 who want to join in the 9 countries, and so they are obviously just 10% of the economic output of the UK, but okay, on the European condition with the euro in the internal market, this can be overcome, as the Chinese have shown, in the next 2 decades. Maybe it will take 3 if we are slower with higher taxes and if we are not really courageous, but we can overcome this output differential and do that. So let's again remind ourselves where we come from. we have to celebrate very much Western European freedom every 6th of June, because the Americans were doing D-Day, leading the liberation of Europe, and making sure that we stay free afterwards as well. But first of all, defeating Nazism, that was of course historic in all ways, and we cannot say often enough thank you very much for the United States of America to liberating Western Europe from the Nazi terror regime. And the big thing was obviously, and that was really where everything turned around, because the Americans were already leaving. By 1946, there were few American troops left in Europe, because the Americans have this kind of American first neutralism, whatever these European wars, let's get out of it, let's let them alone. But we would have all fallen to the Soviets in that case. And Truman was ready for NATO establishment. First the Truman doctrine, and he has really saved Western Europe. He couldn't save all of Europe, but he at least saved Western Europe, and that's historic, and that's what NATO is about. And it was really, again, saving first from the Nazis, and secondly from Soviet takeover. I mean, you have to say how often we can say thank you to the Americans, but we should always be very grateful for that. How did NATO start? Basically because the Soviets really wanted to have Greece and also wanted to have the Bosporus. I mean, the winning stream they had, they were no longer satisfied with just what they won in 1945, and basically they took the power in all these Eastern European countries and all Central European countries, but they also wanted to have Greece. They wanted to have the Bosporus, very important for the Russian logistics. And obviously they were not happy with the status quo of Berlin and Western Germany, and so on and so on. And then gradually the Americans only learned how this was really working out if they will withdraw. And there was no power who could have stopped Stalin in the second part of the 40s. And we were very lucky, actually, that the Americans were then ready to contain and oppose this from Turkey to Germany, and this idea to Sovietize the whole of Western Europe. So that is, of course, also the Bosporus played a big role in the First World War as well, and we have a long-lasting confrontation with Russia on that one. And we can just always, I can remind everybody, without American support there will be a Russian Europe, and this I think nobody really wants. I call also the French president and also the Turkish president to really reconcile and understand how many issues we have. This totally, utterly useless conflict which we have now is a disaster, and we have luckily another proof how successful NATO is to keep all the antagonists in the Eastern Mediterranean apart from each other. Must not be love, but at least there's peace, and it worked the last years since 1952. And this we have to see. The great illusion that war is, I have referred a little bit also to famous authors who were writing about peace and in Europe, and this really 120 years struggle for peace in Europe, which only can be solved with Americans. Yeah, that's a very important slide, because obviously then 10 years after the war, the BRD, the Western German state, was allowed into NATO to be a full ally, recognized. I mean, more historic it cannot be. Still happening in Paris, and it's the role model also for Ukraine. And it was Eisenhower and Adenauer to really work together so closely. The Austrians sidelined the issue and accepted neutrality in a deal, in a dirty deal with the Russians. But ultimately, I think this is really the reason the Cold War was won. The Western Germans with the Americans allied in NATO, and then it was only a question of time, whenever it was 40 difficult years. But nevertheless, then the Cold War was won in a kind of long-term fiscal, industrial, financial competition, which was won by the West. Never forget how terrible the Cold War escalated within the Korea War. Very much the reason behind Western European unification and the NATO foundation. And basically, it luckily came to a more or less armistice then 2 years later. But it was a terrible confrontation, and it was almost lost. Yes, some other of the Cold War crisis, never to forget how tough everything was in '61, the big moment when the tanks were opposing each other at Checkpoint Charlie, because the Eastern Germans and the Soviets basically wanted to control East Berlin completely and wanted to finish the 4 Allied controlled city status it had. And so that was luckily, thanks to General Lucius Clae's happening, very important. Yeah, that's a complicated slide as well. I would like to explain a little bit, because there is all this anti-Americanism in Europe as well. Because, there was Borrell now in Munich at the security conference, always saying, yeah, you Eastern Europeans, you're so pro-American, but we in Spain, we saw the Americans allied with Franco. And I cannot get over that so easily, because the Americans were also allied with Yugoslavia. Everybody who was not with Stalin and with China, because in '49 China fell to Stalin basically, and China was lost, and there was a big confrontation in Europe. It was very much a Cold War crisis, yeah. And then the Americans worked with these World War II personalities which were in charge of their countries. It was not love for Franco or love for Tito, certainly not, which was motivating any of this, but it was just the realpolitik of the Cold War. And definitely nobody should excuse the Americans. And I squeezed Truman here very meanly on this kind of terrible line of Tito, Franco, Mao, and Stalin. But it has to be understood exactly like this. And then it also has a certain logic. And you can understand why Yugoslavia basically turned into a Western client state, socialist façon, but geostrategically within the West. And yes, this is very important in this context to see that from the end of the 19th century, American leaders were extremely active and concerned for European peace, because they're always very afraid that they will have to sort it out and come in, and that they will be somehow thrown into a terrible struggle between the European colonial powers. And here, especially Carnegie, who financed enormously the whole European Peace Palace in Den Haag. In 1913 it was ready, and 1914 everything exploded. Colonel House or Andrew White, really important, and of course President Wilson, all concerned for European peace, American leaders, and we messed it up for a century, and we are not really doing a wonderful job even now, and we cannot have a French-led Europe which is then fighting with the British about fish, having there's two tragic incidents, and suddenly the whole French Islam relation is exploding, and then he's meeting with Putin to sell out the Eastern Europeans, while we have 15 different crises to settle, where only close unity with America can really help us. So no. We cannot have a French-led Europe or something like that is leading us into a Russian domination. We need to be very close to the Americans. Yes, I want to remind everybody how terrible the 70s were. And it was a weak America in these years. The Nixon shock, the end of dollar, when Nixon resigned, Vietnam was lost. The European neutrals were all fencing neutralization, and it was the war in the Middle East. It was, and the Soviets had all the money because of this kind of massive support they got via Austria to be the gas hub, and then to basically turn into an extremely well-financed petrol state from '68 on. And so when the prices rose in '73, they got a windfall which saved them another 20 years of global power status, and that was really very terrible. years. And it took the power and the conviction of these great heroes of the West, Reagan, Bush, Thatcher, Kohl, and these powerful decisions to rearm NATO in '83. The German Bundestag finally consented after massive protests on the 20th of November. This is one of the key dates for the victory in the Cold War. And this is really just to be celebrated and never to forget. It was so difficult. You see all these people here, the Germans were so much against the NATO rearmament, but it was the right decision. Yes, you know, we have obviously all these divisions it will never be pure love between America and the Europeans. Never forget the Iraq War. It was, of course, a very complicated moment, and the scars are still there, and the wisdom of that decision is still to be debated. And, you know, it's a complicated alliance we have, but there is absolutely no alternative to the great alliance of the West, even when it's complicated. And all the time, the American presidents, then they start their presidency with some reset and with some looking in the soul and with great friendship, yeah. And then when they are getting a little bit into the reality, they understand how the Russian regime under Putin is basically towards the West, and there is no goodwill on that one. Yeah, it's a zero-sum competition struggle. What they see over there, and when we hopefully have now experienced the U.S. president not starting with another reset and another kind of foolish attempt to somehow over the head of the Europeans work with the Russian president and then ignore the interests of the Eastern Europeans, because that's basically what it is about. Yeah. Yes, it's the original European sin, the anti-Americanism. Yeah. And so a divided West is an easy picking for Russia. This is what we can sum up the last years, and it's always so tempting because of many issues. We have this kind of relation with America built on envy, on jealousy, and then we have different historic perspectives on issues, World War II and everything, Cold War, and then the Russians come with their narrative, with their energy, power, with their threat level, with their historic view on things, and then we are divided. The original European sin, anti-Americanism. This is what we hear. There's many reasons for that, you know. We have this imperial competition, the Western powers, UK, France, with this young republic. We have, of course, a German anti-Americanism, but it's, you know, it's a little bit, Germany, Western Germany especially, is less anti-American. The Eastern Germans, they have not gone through this re-education and the common destiny of NATO membership in the early phases of the Cold War. And so you have also this, you have much more anti-Americanism in Eastern Germany, that's what I wanted to say, and much more nostalgia also towards the Soviet Union, sadly. You see that from the energy politics to the political voting pattern. You have also this anti-colonial, Southern European anti-Americanism, you know, that's also a major issue. And you have also, this kind of specific where I'm very much focused on, is this in the ex-Austrian-Hungarian Empire. You have the Czechs less, yeah, they are more like the Polish, yeah, but it starts with the Slovaks and everything, the Austrians included, everything south. You have significant anti-Americanism, unfortunately. And you have also in the ex-Soviet states like Ukraine, you have also a lot of lack of information. These people were in the Stalin narrative for very long, so it is difficult. And, you know, it needs a lot of learning, a lot of understanding, a lot of explanation to bring people into the correct understanding about what actually happened, which is part of this video, what I'm trying to do, to explain why we are so anti-American, yeah. It's part anti-capitalism from the West, yeah. It's part this problem, you know. Now I want to talk what we have to achieve here first, yeah. NATO enlargement, a common market of the NATO allies, common travel, a common narrative, also explaining the world together, and also a stronger OECD, and also less anti-Americanism in Europe, and less anti-Europeanism also in America, and to have 2 yearly summits, and to really grow much closer together in the coming years. That's really very important, yeah. And also to build a new consensus here and in America, what we can achieve together and what is actually happening. Yes, understanding the 9th of May, the Americans have supported the development of the European Union. From day one, Jean Monnet was very much supported by the Americans. From day one, because they understood there is a big, of course it was a big disaster. The Marshall Plan was one help, the Council of Europe was one help, the OECD was one help, NATO of course, yeah. But then the EU was basically the fourth and surprising element where really some Americans have said Monnet and his idea of building a United States of Europe, this is the right way. Copy the American model. And really in the Cold War crises, one by one, here's the whole timeline of how it happened. Then was the moment when we could really achieve something like this in a unique circumstances with the Treaty of Paris to really go into a real supranational unification, and this made all the difference long term. Yeah? We can cover. Good. Celebrating the courage of the founding fathers of the EU. I think we can never be too. It was dramatic crises in France when they lost in Dien Bien Phu and the Eastern German uprising, and the whole dynamics of this terrible 50s. Yeah? With Budapest and then the big moments when we still, our founding fathers had the stamina and the courage to unite former enemies in the Rome Treaty, and this is really something to be celebrated every day again. What we need to understand is also that we need to be more open. The Americans have from the victory moment 30 years ago, and they have really taken in 80 million people more. This is quite enormous. Huh? And this is the courage and the leadership we need to copy. This is really quite an enormous number. Like the whole Germany has moved to America in the last 30 years, and this is really quite amazing. And still, we have to understand how it is. Russia is still the biggest nation in the Eurasian continent, if you want to say so. And alone, we will be always, it will be the Russian Europe. And, when you see the difference economically between Europe and the American growth rates in population, it's quite astonishing, actually. And so we really need more openness. We need more unity. And of course, we need also learning from the Americans. So what is the economic model? Because our economic model, especially since the financial crisis, is questionable. We have not included new countries because we have done that if you see it here, I want to show it, maybe I can try. Here, this was this enormously successful years when we could really catch up. No, I have made a small mistake. No, okay, good. Now, okay, we could see it here. Anyhow, I've repeated the same slide. So it's here the 2000, the enlargement years. This was really very successful. We catch up very much until 2008, yeah? And then we have not allowed any new country into the European Union. We have had all these internal crises, and the GDP prosperity gap to the US has really widened again. So what is the answer? Bring in the Eastern Europeans, open the trade system, open to people, lower taxes, and bring more unity in the European Union, that we have the adequate response mechanisms towards crises like in 2008, because the Americans are much more united. They could also mobilize more public money, and then they were able to really respond effectively united towards the crisis of 2008, and they had only a minor problem. And so we had not this unity, and that was, of course, now in this crisis 2020, we have achieved common bonds and common issue of debt. That was really very good. But also in the meantime, we have not really achieved a lot when it comes to free trade. Yes, the Japanese agreement, yes, the Vietnamese agreement, all very fine, but still, and the Canadian agreement, but no agreement with the US, no agreement in force with Mercosur, and still a big question if that will be ratified, unfortunately. I made a separate video about that one. So what we need to see is here, we need lower taxes like in the US, we need more openness and more unity, and we are still far behind the Americans. When you compare the federal states of America with the European Union states, then you see just a few of them really are in the top list of the best 50. Denmark and Switzerland is not EU member, Luxembourg, but a lot of the countries, the Americans are still much richer. It's not only that we have taken in 100 million poor Eastern Europeans in the last 20 years, but it's also an important achievement, no doubt about it, and it has also lowered the average, obviously, in the comparison. But we are at 36, and also our richer countries, it's not that Germany is somewhere so super performance here, it's like Ohio or so. No. Also Austria is just, in the 40, it's not even on the 50, as I see it, It would not, and now it's this video here. But anyhow, we have a lot to do to catch up, and I think that should be the aim, to be as rich as the American. Or it doesn't anybody agree? Anyhow, I would like to show the slide because I really love it. What we have achieved the last 30 years since the grandiose 80s and the victory point, thanks to the leaders of the 80s who were making that possible. And peace has a dividend. Imagine, it is 2.5 billion more people who are living in this world because the Cold War was ended, and prosperity, technology, and all the other institutions worked so fine. From the GDP level, from 22 to 86, it's unbelievable. The tax level down, GDP up, peace, and we have such an enormous new, better world, I cannot understand when anybody says, oh, the Western world, the current global economic order is not working. It is working. It's enormously well working. With this massive increase, maybe there's other issues attached, like resources and like, distributional issues, But we have all the institutions to address them. We just need to improve the existing system. Certainly not destroy it or take it down, as I'm talking. And when you just don't see the last 30 years as a major, unbelievable success in the, I don't know what you, it's somehow amazing, So what is at stake when you compare the European Union? We have really to work to contain Russia and to be more united, And we have to ensure the Americans stay committed, And we need a strong NATO to protect Europe, and we need to improve and complete all the institutions we have, This one I have shown already. I like him very much, so maybe a second slide for sure. It's not a bad thing, but ultimately what I want to talk is about the need for completing a continental union. That's the thing, because that's what makes really the difference between the US and the EU, that the US is covering the whole of the continent, of course, Mexico and Canada, but, we also cannot include all countries like Turkey, or we have also FTA, like that would be the comparable. But, Ukraine and the Balkans, everybody in, obviously, and then build the institutions we need, in order to be efficient and to have a real EU level. And we just have too less power in Brussels and still too much power in the member states, and we need to change that. But not on an anti-American basis. Jean Monnet was an absolute great friend of America, but together we will be much more successful. I call it the heavy price of European disunity, and this is basically, the price of our various complex organizations, divisions, our inability to really unite and bring the Balkans and Ukraine into the EU, and this all makes us poorer. And we could have $12 trillion GDP more if we would be more united, have American-style institutions and the continental union. Over time, we will achieve that. I'm confident, but it's just so complicated, and that's the $12 trillion question. We should really ask ourselves every day: why are we not so successful as the Americans, and what we can learn, how we can reduce taxes, how we can really promote entrepreneurship, but also have a bigger market, have more important EU-level institutions, reduce the costs on the member state level, and really tear down all these borders internally, which we have in the brain and in the reality. And never, never ever go to Euro-nationalism. This is a French-led folly some have here, because now, of course, Trump was very much fueling this fire of the European neutralists and the third way, the Tito fans and all these haters of market, of capitalism, of NATO and the free world. And, they were all then against all this uniting with this populists from the right who also hate the markets, who also hate America, maybe for other reasons, but it is a total mess. And so there is this kind of sovereignty. This is complete failure, unfortunately, which the French are promoting. Instead, we should transfer the French UN security to the EU, and we should make sure that the OECD moves from Paris to Brussels, and we should really make more unity in order to be sure that we succeed, and we have the spirit of the Atlantic Charter, which we should revive and make sure that we feel much more united between, even after Brexit. It's really important to keep the British engaged and committed, and to have the Americans on board in order to have Europe safe from Russian aggression. So that's, of course, one of the sources of European jealousy and anti-Americanism. You see also, of course, at the end of the day, at the big conferences for Molotov, there was a lot of divisions where powerful Russian and powerful American presidents were then dividing up Europe, in a sense. That's one of the ways that's all perceived, yeah. And obviously there is, this has to be overcome by a strong European pillar inside NATO. And we have to be very much thankful to these European founding fathers, including the key Americans who have helped Europe to develop. And I have here listed the most important ones. Also the economists from Mises, Hayek, but the foreign ministers Acheson, Adenauer, Eisenhower, Jean Monnet, and of course General Marshall. And these are the personalities which really have led to free Europe and to our institutions. And I don't see that every European knows them. This is the 10 names everybody should know. And we have a little bit to build a common European narrative in that direction. And that's basically what I see as free Europe, also including all NATO allies, CEFTA, NATO, OECD, and the Eastern Partnership countries, all without Russia, obviously. And maybe one day there is a peaceful, democratic, free and federal Russia to be included, but certainly not under Putin. So I have here some renaming of the streets, especially, let's not forget, also the Austrian guilt on the First World War. Austria has chosen war, that we really have also Austria as a NATO member. That's really very important. Also to be a good role model for Serbia and for Ukraine and for Bosnia. And also in Austria to somehow counter this narrative of a Soviet victory and all this. Ultimately it was the Americans who liberated Austria. It was the Americans who supported the Soviets to be able to reach Eastern Austria. Without American support, they could have never reached Vienna. And also to say thank you for the support of the liberation of Eastern Europe. James Baker in Tirana, a very famous visit in the year 91. Freedom works. And also again the Americans, even Trump, you don't need to like him, but respect him for this one, because he tried at the end, in the 4 years of his presidency, at least for North Macedonia, the Americans, let's put it overall, really have done an enormous thing. And for Kosovo, in the end, it was also very important. We have up to now not been able to convince 5 of our EU member states and NATO allies, 4 of them are NATO allies, who are getting massive subsidies, billions, to recognize Kosovo. So on that one, of course, on the Balkans, without America, it would be a disaster, and thanks a lot. Now, of course, the Europeans should invite a peace summit for Kosovo, Serbia, and Bosnia, but I don't see it. Anyhow, let's not forget what was the most important crisis of the last years, and that was, of course, in 2014, still under Obama, and that is, we hopefully Biden will be more proactive American leader. It's obviously, and this is the heroes of Luhansk. This was the biggest battle in the Ukraine-Russian war of 2014, where the Russians have massacred many of the Ukrainian heroes. Yeah, this is, I would like to make a special emphasis, because there was the Austrian president on the Austrian National Day claiming that in the Moscow Declaration 43, Austrian neutrality was decided. No. It was not like that. Yeah. In the Moscow declarations, the Soviets were very much on the line of the Americans, because they were massively supported. Yeah. We are talking about 11 trillion of 1940 money. It was massive assets which the Americans, via Harry Hopkins, have delivered to the Soviet Union. Otherwise, that's what I said before, they would have never reached Vienna or nor Berlin without this massive support of the Americans. And that was good, so that was necessary. But let's not forget that they have broken all the promises of Moscow. There was no free Austria afterwards. There was no free Austria. It was occupied by the Soviet Union. And it was neutrality was then later a dirty deal, which had to be accepted in order to get the Soviets to keep the Moscow Declaration. The Americans have done enormous support for Europe. This is the 16th of April, the EU Day for the Marshall Plan. That was really to lift Europe out of total poverty and destruction and save it from the Soviets. And this is a historic achievement. Yeah, we cannot. This is the OECD Day, basically. I call it like this. And this is Lucius Clay and the hero of America. These are basically the most important Americans everybody should know. Lucius Clay for Germany, Mark Clark for Austria, and also, of course, Marshall is more famous for the General Marshall Plan and for the OECD Foundation. Story. Thanks, USA. We were not so lucky to do the same for the Ukrainians and Georgians, basically because the Western Germans, they were happy with themselves and they blocked it, and being under pressure from Russia. And then came the disaster of Bucharest summit. It was the end of Bush presidency, so it was only for Croatia and for Albania possible to join. But we have now then paid a heavy price, and the Georgians have paid a heavy price with the Russian war and the Ukraine war by the invasion. This is all the result of this appeasement failure we had in Bucharest. Yes, and this is a little bit about our complicated relationship with our American friends from time to time. It's always also in Moscow, America, Europe looks confusingly complicated. Everybody, how many countries, where is what, and so. And then it's a little bit difficult. Now we really need an experienced president who knows Europe in all its complexities, because it's always easier to call Moscow, because Russia, everybody knows. And you know what is exactly going on in Eastern Europe. Some American presidents really had a lot of issues to understand in this TV duel in 76. Anyhow, I was not re-elected. So what I say is, and this is also my appeal to the American leadership, in Europe we are in a kind of a power struggle between the European political elite and the member states. Yeah. This is what you had basically in the 19th century in many different ways, not in the Civil War, I don't refer, but after the Civil War, to really get the American institutions going fully adopted, and to have the Senate to be elected and to have a central bank. Let's call it the progressive area in the 20th century. And in Europe, it would be really very helpful if the American institution of the union level help the union level in the EU to win our power struggle, and it's also in the American interest. Because this is a natural partnership. Work with Mr. Borrell, if you are the Secretary of State, yeah. The Vice President is the leader of the Senate, to work with Mr. Michel, who is the Council President. That's basically our Senate. The Council and the Senate have the same ideological, institutional kind of basic understanding. And it's very important that you strengthen the Senate and, of course, the House of Representatives and the European Parliament. Not to meet from time to time ad hoc from some global IPU meetings, but all the time, intensively to work together. It's not the German Bundestag, the partner of the House of Representatives. It's the European Parliament. Yeah? And the Senate is very logical, the Council. And the president of the EU Commission is the president of America. That's the partners, that's the authorities, and of course the Secretary of State with our High Representative for Foreign Affairs. And then we can win on the European level the power from our member states, because we are more taken seriously in a sense, or they are more taken seriously, and then it makes all the sense. And this is very important to build up this institutional cooperation. And it matters very much, yeah? Because we are in this global competition. And, I always like to remind that it's 448, yeah, and living million Europeans, also producing 18 trillion of GDP. So what I want to say with that is, and also I hope that the other 9 countries can join, so we will be 515, yeah. We are quite a lot of people living in many different member states, and it's quite complicated. I understand it. It's confusing from Washington. But it's very good to make us the prime partner here. That should not exclude the British. This will always be special, I understand it. But, this is the powerful level of representativity. And it's 500,000 of Europeans hoping for American leadership and friendship. And also the 67 from Eastern Europe to be supported. And Russia might be interesting with nukes and with opportunities. And you talk to one guy and he does things. Yeah? But, it's just very much a smaller region, just a third of the European Union. And economically, it's just 1/10. And the crisis in Russia will continue. So, what is really needing is a less American EU bashing, because what we have seen in the last 4 years was quite unbelievable, all this bashing about NATO budgets and, this EU, that we are protectionists, that we don't spend enough, this is all, it was all so negative, everything connected with EU was negative, yeah. That was, of course, part of the American first ideology, to somehow talk Europe little and say we are the problem and not Russia. I mean, Russia attacks us, but we are the problem because we don't defend ourselves as much, yeah? And that we're stealing money from the Americans, and that the trade deficit, at the end of the day, that's all bogus, yeah? It's all not true. And the Europeans are spending quite a lot. Obviously, we are not able to power project ourselves, yeah? Somewhere, but that's also not the main intention of the European Union. It's the NATO is a defensive alliance to contain Russia, not to project power to Afghanistan or Iraq. This is to be clear. And then President Trump has supported all these nationalists in power in Poland and Hungary, who were anyhow, especially the Hungarians, betraying the Europeans. At the moment the American president was out, Gazprom was in, so I don't know what kind of super allies they are. So ultimately we need an American president who works with the European institutions to really stop encouraging Euroscepticism, but supports the Euro, supports the European Union. And it's a major task, I have already talked about it, that the EU has achieved in the last 15 years to bring 30 new countries into the European Union. I mean, this is impressive and should be really applauded, supported, and contributed, and not to, when there is one more like a nationalistic government to find that, that's really good, we can annoy the Europeans and fly to Warsaw. I mean, this is to Budapest. It's not exactly the way. That's the wrong American politics. Yeah. Here, just to remind everybody what is Orban doing. Obviously, with Rosatom working, trying to be the gas hub for the Eastern Europeans, like the Austrians, and making deals with the Russians as much as possible. Yeah, the NATO debate we have to also readjust a little bit in the next decade, because it's very important to see also the EU contribution towards the reconstruction of Eastern Europe. And some countries really don't have the will nor the capacities to project power and to invest so much in military. It's better they spend, like for example Germany and Austria, better spend German and Austrian taxpayer money on the EU. And this is anyhow transferred to Eastern European security and infrastructure. And so that's much more logical than to insist on the 2%. And it's much better to have 1% for global development, 2% for the EU, 2% for NATO. And there is a certain flexibility inside the free budget areas, where then, for example, the Americans say, okay, we don't have a EU logically, and we spend more on global power projection to provide security, and the Europeans to spend more on global good governance in the OECD or also in the EU, because our money anyhow is wasted because we don't have political will to project power outside Europe so much. Yeah. So even when you spend another 40 billion per year of your German taxpayers' money, it will not be the same bang for the buck, as we say, when you do it in America, because you really want to project power if you think it's necessary. But in Germany, there's no consensus, nor there is in Austria, nor in most other European countries. So we have to be a little bit flexible in this debate and also take into account the massive, expensive necessary to integrate Ukraine in the European Union. That's the most important, obviously. Yes, Russian readmittance to the Council of Europe, that's anyhow gets me too annoyed. But, it's again the sign when the Americans are doing American first, then the Europeans have to go into a more appeasement line. That's the logic, The Americans are not very trustworthy, go American first, we have to make peace with Russia and sell out Ukraine. That's the mechanism. So you have to really stay with us, and it's important. We have to stay together. So that's the long-term vision. Long-term, I'm for fast-track vision of that one. NATO membership, Euro adoption, and then integrating the 9 new countries in the European Union. For this, we need American leadership, because it won't be easy. But you have helped us with the BRD at the times, with many others together. This is the way to do it, and I made many videos about that one already. You can see that one. I would like to talk in that American video now about the different trends in policies, because the higher population densities in America now, increasing population increase and so, is leading to a different kind of governance style which is necessary. When you have very highly populated Eastern Sea coast, you need a little bit of a different governance, a more European governance, and then in the Midwest. So this is, of course, a complicated debate in America, from weapons, from civil administration, from public health, from registering. In all European countries, we have to register where we live. In America, that seems not the case. You have, of course, a lot of flexibility and freedoms which the Europeans lack. So what I say is a governance approximation, that learning from each other mutually, and that we overcome our growth problem and you overcome your governance issue. And we have, I think, the reason in America is the higher population density, and that we have a lot of experience. And then also we need in Europe to cut taxes and to give more freedom in order to have higher growth, because we need to catch up to the Americans, and we need to see how the ideal optimum is. But let's see that China, for example, when you see the Peterson chart, is already next year again at 110 of the GDP of 2019, whereas Europe and the US, we are all hanging out. So, and the UK especially bad. So it's really not so perfect what we are doing now these years, and we need to improve. Obviously, I like very much Paul Ryan and the tax cut. That was a major success. So let's give Trump presidency the honor for this one. It was long overdue. if you now will reduce, if America will go up with the taxes again, the only effect is that all the global corporates, basically US corporates, they will just hide their money in European offshore again and invest it elsewhere than in America. So it would be a tragic mistake to go to any high corporate taxation anyhow. And when you see the global trend, it's all very low, and we will definitely see more tax competition downwards in Europe. So if you want to hurt yourself, raise the taxes, but hopefully there will be not that one the focus of a Biden presidency. That's it. Yes, I have here these government approximations. That's obviously not everything needs to be harmonized. You know, the Americans are the only ones with Liberia and Myanmar to use feet and miles and so. That's okay. Everybody can do everything as he wants in a way. But we always think that, for example, the Federal Reserve System is the result of a study visit of the US Congress and to the EU states, UK, Germany, France, understanding how central bank works and then building the central bank. And I know some people are not happy with the central bank, but you know, that's the basis for winning the 2 World Wars and the Cold War. It was the united fiscal capacities of America which then allowed all these industrial capacities and all these successes. Yeah, so this is really very important. And also our central bank is basically copied then again from the success of the Federal Reserve. So mutual learning from each other and discussing seriously what is the best system and what is the best public policy for a Western country to tackle certain public policy challenges. Yeah, I think we should be open to learn from each other and to compare each other on a member state to member state level, not on a, because, you know, US to Austria is a bit ridiculous. Yeah? But EU to US, and then break it down on the member states and understand what that kind of EU definitely needs stronger law enforcement on the federal level. There's no doubt about it. The FBI, the Supreme Court, all this we need, yeah. But then on the other hand, you also need to see that the US needs much better municipal governance. The municipal governance in Europe is excellent, yeah, in many ways. Yeah. You can say that's intrusive, yeah, but you know, to register guns and to have a public safety and health system which is responding in the case of a crisis is very useful. So see what the European municipalities do and can and have, yeah. And that's, I think, something to really consider. And also other institutions, we need to see what we can learn from each other. And that basically is the power of the West to be open, united, and strong and connected. Yeah, I have made this 2-3 about the TTIP because that was my big topic. I was so happy 20 years ago I never liked the word TTIP but the EU-US free trade agreement, you know, we have it with half of the world, and the US has it with half of the world, but we never managed to get it. It's very, very bad, and we have to really start it. And we should celebrate when it's done. And Trump obviously ended the last hope for TTIP when he came. And obviously, but even Obama and Merkel didn't do it when they could, yeah. So and we didn't do the Doha round, you know, is in trade we are always happy to be bad. And then we pay the price later. We need to get this done once and for all, and this is my appeal. This has to be happening before the European Parliament in 2024 and before the next US presidential. This is the key deliverable which needs to be done and set in stone, ratified by all parliaments and Congress, and have a free trade agreement between the US and the EU. This is really the central piece, together, obviously, with NATO enlargement, to at least bring 3-4 more countries into NATO: Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, Kosovo, and Bosnia. These are my 5 favorites. If it's possible to settle with Serbia, to seal peace and recognition with mutual NATO membership, then also Serbia, and get some of the neutrals at least in. And obviously that we make better, also have a separate presentation about OECD and enlargement. That's a separate topic. But the key thing is that we economically and strategically more unite with the US. Biden presidency. And the case for it, it's so much there. This is a bit important to understand also the difference between a trade balance, which Trump knows only, but also then a current account, because it takes into account the massive American investment into Europe, the foreign direct investment, and they then pay dividends back for the resulting success. And that's very good. So, and that has to be also taken into account in the so-called current account balance. And that's why ultimately America is obviously having a very profitable relationship with Europe, and not we also have a very profitable, because we are secure. We have also market access. It's mutually beneficial. But it's not true that we Europeans exploit the Americans in any way. It's a completely ridiculous idea. We are like brothers and sisters, if you want it. The mutual FTA, it's in 5.5 trillion. No other continents in the world are so united, and that's also very good. So, and we should really make sure that we even intensify the cooperation in the 2020s in what I call this American-European decade to come. And ultimately, long term, to be ambitious for 2028, to think about a common capital market, a common labor market, a public service market. There's a lot of integration steps ahead for us, and that's obviously what is really a wonderful future ahead for the West. And it's a lot of prosperity up there, and it's not about chlorinated chicken to stop us. And even the corona we will overcome with modern science, with technology, with also necessary good governance, administration, and that this is basically the idea, to be systematic, rational, responsible, reasonable, and to work very much together in this concept of the West, of NATO, of free trade agreement between the EU and the US, and a strong partnership